Exposure controls is easily one of the most important sections in this class, and we've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to get into all the various controls that you have for controlling the exposure, a lot of the different tools that you can implement, and show you a lot of different ways to make sure that you're getting the right exposure. Now, this all starts with the mode dial. This is what controls the shutter speeds and apertures on the camera and how you're going to set the controls. So let's take a closer look at the mode dial. So in a generic sense, there is a full auto mode, which is going to be a very simple mode. We'll talk about that first. There's a lot of options that give you some manual control, and then there's some custom modes that you can customize exactly how you want them to work. Let's talk about the easiest one to begin with, and that is the auto mode, which is also known as the scene intelligent mode. And it's intelligent because it can recognize different types of scenes, at least some very simple types of scenes. And so what will happen when you put it in the full auto mode is the camera will do some relatively slight adjustments for different types of scenarios, like portraits and landscapes and close-up and things like that. Now, the difference from one image to the next, even though it may radically change the environment and the lighting, it doesn't change dramatically. It changes a little bit. And so the most important thing to know about this for anybody who's kind of a new photographer is you can do everything the camera is doing as long as you know what to do. So the camera's not doing anything secret that you can't do on your own. It's just if you want to do it yourself, you can actually go much further with it and do much more with it. But this is a perfect mode if you're going to hand your camera to a friend or relative who doesn't understand how to work your complicated camera, and you want them to be able to just take basic, simple photos and not mess up a lot of your settings, well then, yeah, the full auto mode is going to be a very good mode for them because it's very, very simple, and it's going to generally get you decent photos in a wide variety of situations. Now, you are allowed to make some changes, but there are going to be some changes that you are not allowed to change. The function menu is something that we'll talk about later on in this class, but I do want to mention right here that you can get into it and you can make some changes. Let's go ahead and dive into the function menu real quickly. I just want to show you the limitations that we have in here. So putting the camera into the full auto mode here with the mode dial, and we're going to see on the back of the camera that we have our green camera icon, which is our simple mode. Now, if we want to press the function button, this is normally a shortcut to basic features that we would want to adjust. And we can go in here and we can see that there are some things that are highlighted and some things that are grayed out. These are things that are too complicated, too sophisticated to be changing in this particular mode. But if we want to change the drive mode, well, we can go in here and we can change some settings of the drive mode, but this is not the full collection. This is a limited collection in here. And so same thing with a lot of these other features is that you can change some features, but not all of them, and which is why we have a lot of things grayed out here. These are the child safety locks on some of the features of the camera that kind of irritate somebody who's a little bit more familiar with the camera like myself. I don't like this, but it's nice for certain types of people who just want to limit the number of options and mistakes that they can possibly make. And so this is not a mode that I see a lot of people who own this camera using themselves very much. It's just nice to have a simple mode if you're going to loan it out. All right, next up is the program mode. Now this is actually kind of like the auto mode in the sense that it is setting shutter speeds and apertures, but it doesn't give you all the child safety locks, allows you to make a number of changes and allows you full access into the menu system, the function menu, full menu, and everything else. And so the program mode's kind of a nice place to go when you just want basic pictures, but let the camera do the basic operations of shutter speeds and aperture. Now, when you look through the viewfinder, down on the bottom left, looking through the viewfinder, you'll see your shutter speeds, and then you'll see your aperture, and then over in the right-hand corner, you'll see your ISO, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And in the upper left, you'll see that you are actually in the P or program auto mode. Now, one of the nice things about being in the program mode is that you don't have to accept the settings that the camera is giving you. You can shift them a little bit if you want. And so if you don't like what the camera recommends, well, you can turn either the front dial or the back dial in that particular case. Let's go ahead and give this a try. So what we'll do is we'll get our camera set up. We're going to change our dial on the top to the program mode. We'll see on the back of our camera that we have the P in the upper left corner of the frame. And down on the bottom, you can see that we have 1/50th of a second at f4 for right now. Now, in order to make this demonstration work right for you, I'm going to just jump ahead a couple of steps, and I'm going to change the ISO to something that works right here in the studio, and I'm going to say ISO 800. And we'll change a little bit on our display to get this narrowed down, and you can see we are at 125th of a second at f6.3. Now, if we don't like that setting, what we can do is we can turn the front dial of our camera, and we are getting faster shutter speeds. Now, we are limited by f4 on this particular lens, but if we want to go to slower shutter speeds, let's say we wanted to go down to, let's see, a 15th of a second right there, we can do so at f18. Now, if we want to control it with the back dial, it's doing the exact same thing as the front dial. And so you can do the adjustments with either the front or the back. And so once you shoot that, you can have it set exactly where you want. And what it's doing is it's looking at how much light is coming in. It looks at where the ISO is set, and then it's just trying to give you an in-between shutter speed and aperture. What it's trying to do in many respects is to give you a fast enough shutter speed that you can handhold the camera. Cameras do not know if they're on tripods or not, and so it doesn't understand what you're trying to do if you're trying to do something fancy with it. And so it's a very generic mode. It's good for very basic picture taking. All right, next up is aperture priority. This is good when you want to set a particular depth of field with the aperture, and you'll just let the shutter speed be wherever it may be. So this is going to be good if you want to stop the aperture down to get a lot of depth of field from foreground to background, stop it down to 16, 22, or somewhere in that range. If you want really shallow depth of field, open your lens up to 1.4 if it has it, and you're going to get really shallow depth of field. This is a good general mode, in my opinion, because it gives you a wide range of different types of images that you can take very, very simply. And so what you'll notice is that when you are changing the apertures, those apertures are now going to be orange in color, letting you know that those are something that you are manually changing. Let's go ahead and take a look at the aperture priority mode. So on the mode dial, we change over to aperture priority here. And on the back of the camera, you can see that as soon as we turn the dial, we're going to start getting an orange color here. Let me just change it again on the top from program to aperture priority. You'll notice the 5.6 is not orange right yet because that's still the automated setting that the camera has given it. But as soon as I start changing the aperture, it becomes orange, and it will adjust the shutter speeds accordingly. So if I want lots of depth of field, I can dial it down to f22. If I want less depth of field or a faster shutter speed, I can dial it the other direction. And it's pretty foolproof. The only thing you really need to watch out for is, am I using a shutter speed that is too slow for my hand holding of the camera? If you are hand holding the camera at all, you might need to play around with the ISO or adjust the aperture to get yourself back to a reasonable shutter speed. And so it's a good, simple walk around mode for a lot of people who don't know what their next shot is going to be. All right, next up is shutter priority, and this is kind of the opposite of aperture priority. You get to set the shutter speed. The camera will figure out the aperture, and this can be good if you have something that's moving very quick and you know you want a very fast shutter speed, say 1,000th of a second to freeze motion, or if you're trying to blur some motion like a waterfall or a river, you could set it down to a slow shutter speed like a full second. Now, the key thing with the shutter priority is that there is a lot of options that you can choose that you will not have an appropriate aperture for, and there will be a blinking exposure warning with the aperture blinking. Let me go ahead and show you an example of this. So we're going to go from aperture priority to shutter priority on our mode dial up on top. And now we're going to start adjusting our shutter speeds with our dial in the front of the camera. And you can see that the apertures are changing in conjunction with our shutter speeds. But if we were to choose a faster shutter speed, let's go up to 1,000th of a second, you can see that the image is getting pretty dark and the f4 is blinking, letting us know that the camera does not have enough light coming in. It will allow us to shoot a photo, and that photo will indeed come out dark. And the reason is, well, you're in control of the camera and you can do what you want with the camera. And if you want to shoot a picture that's underexposed, that's up to you. But you need to be paying attention to that blinking f4. And what I would do is I would either back off on the shutter speed to a point at where it's not blinking. And in this particular case, we can do it around 3/20th or 2/50th of a second, and we can get an even exposure. Or if I really wanted to shoot at 1,000th of a second, well, then I would need to probably go over to the ISO and bump up the ISO appropriately so that I could shoot a picture there and get an even exposure. Now, one of the other options that you could do is you could put the camera in auto ISO, and then it would automatically adjust the ISO for the situation, for the light of the situation that you're in. And that might not be a bad option for some people who want to control the shutter speed and let the ISO and aperture be adjusted by the camera. And so maybe a more advanced option for some people, but one that can work pretty well. All right, next up is manual, which is, of course, my favorite, because now you get control of everything, shutter speeds and apertures. And so in order to do this, you'll control the apertures with the front dial, the shutter speeds on the back dial, and now you're going to need to start paying attention to the metering area in your camera. There's an exposure metering system in your camera. You'll see an indicator in your viewfinder or on the monitor on the back of the camera, and you're going to have to make sure that you're making adjustments so that you're getting a proper exposure. Now, I like manual exposure because I get consistent exposures when I am shooting one photo after another with consistent lighting, and I want to get different compositions and I want to try some different techniques. All of those photos are going to come out the same brightness level. So they're going to look similar when it comes to brightness levels, and I don't need to go into post-production and make adjustments on those. It also works well in tricky lighting situations that might be unusually bright or unusually dark, or just have something unusual going on that might fool a traditional light meter. And so it's very handy those. You get it set up at the beginning, and then once again, consistency is nice because all of your photos are consistent in their exposure system. Now, one of the nice fun options when it comes to manual photography and manually setting your shutter speeds is the bulb mode. This is great for doing long time exposures, nighttime type work. Generally, the way this works is you put it in the bulb mode, you press down on the shutter release, and as long as you leave your finger on the shutter release, the shutter stays open. Now, of course, this technique is not very good because you might be moving the camera with your finger on the camera. So it's probably best to use one of those cable releases that you can get for this camera. I'll talk about those specifically later on. But this is a nice technique for doing long time exposures. Now, this is something that you can go into the exposure menu and you can set particulars about how the bulb mode is set. You can set it for 1 minute or 2 minutes or 4 minutes so that you do not need a cable release in order to do it. You can set it up specifically for as long as you want. Now, anytime you are shooting in a manual exposure, you're going to need to look at the light meter or the exposure indicator. Now, it's got a graphic meter in the viewfinder, but it has a numeric light meter on the monitor on the back of the camera. That'll show if you are +1 stop or -2/3 of a stop. And then generally speaking, you're probably going to want to start at a 0.0 or even exposure for your first shot to figure out what's appropriate for that particular situation. In the viewfinder, you have a graphic light meter that shows you a graph and where you are on that graph. Even exposure, of course, is at 0, and this is going to be broken up into third stops and 1 stop, so you can see exactly how far off you are. Now, as I say, generally you're going to want to start with a even exposure, but some pictures require a little bit of overexposure, some will require underexposure, so it varies from shot to shot. And so you'll be able to see that indicated by the little arrow. Now, if it goes more than 2 stops off, you're just going to get an arrow pointing in that far direction, which indicates you are way far off, and you probably need to make some significant shutter speed, aperture, or ISO changes to get it back to an even exposure. So 0 is generally where you're going to start off a lot, but why do we have these other numbers in here? Well, the 2 indicates that a camera goes 2 stops over and 2 stops under in what it's going to show you, but the other numbers there are for bracketing reasons and for exposure compensation to show you how much over and under exposure you are. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this particular section here. And so manual is a great way to shoot. So let's go ahead and get our camera set up manually in a couple different ways. First thing we'll do is we'll change our mode dial to manual on the mode dial up on the top of the camera. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to set my ISO first. I would like this to be a reasonable ISO for here in the studio, and I'm going to say ISO 800. Now, we're getting a pretty dark image here, and so I'm going to adjust our shutter speed down just to something so I can see it a little bit more clearly here. I'm going to adjust our aperture to 5.6. I think that's a good aperture for what I'm pointed at. It looks a little on the bright side, and my indicator here at the bottom says plus 1.0. So that means it's one stop overexposed, what it thinks is correct. And if I adjust my shutter speeds here and back, I can adjust it according to where I think it's right. Now, as I said, I would normally adjust this to the 0.0 setting, which is going to be right here, for my first shot and go, okay, well, that's a starting point. Well, you know, we have a white table in here on the bottom, and this whole cabinet is white. So this is probably a little bit brighter than average, and I should shoot this at maybe plus 0.7. I'm going to say plus 0.3, a third stop overexposure. We also have the histogram there in the bottom right-hand corner, giving us some additional information about where it's right. But this is what's looking to my eye as the best exposure in this particular case. And so, yes, 0 is a good place to have your exposure for manual as a starting point, but you need to adjust it for each scene that you are in, and that gives you full control. So good option for a lot of people for a lot of great shooting with this camera. All right, next up, 1, 2, and 3 is the memory recall positions. And so this is where you can set the camera up to work in a particular style with a particular set of features, and you can quickly go to those by just turning the dial to 1, 2, or 3. And the idea here is that you might have a couple different types of photography that you do, and it requires a lot of changes from the focusing system to the metering system to customization of the camera. And it just takes too long to go from one to the other by changing all of those things individually. You can do those with preset memory settings here. Now, it's actually more to it than you first see on here. You think, okay, well, I got 3 different things that I can memorize. Oh no, there is actually more. There's 3 places on the dial that you can get to, but there is more that can be stored in the camera, or more specifically on the memory card. Now, this is also separate between stills video and slow and quick video, in that you can have 3 different setups when you're in the stills mode, 3 different when you're in the video or movie mode, and 3 different when you're in stills and quick movies. And so there's a lot of different options that you can have in there. Now, there are ones that are stored on the memory card that you can also have. So besides 1, 2, and 3, you can also have M1, M2, M3, and M4, and they're going to be stored on a memory card on a file. Now, this is where you need to be a little bit careful about your file management and card management, because if you're shooting images on a memory card and reformatting that card, well, you're going to be getting rid of this particular file. So sometimes people who use this will have a special memory card, maybe one of their older ones that has a small file size, because this doesn't take up very much memory space. And they'll have a special card that they will load on and have for their special settings. So if you wanted to do that, that is one of your options. Now, the way that you get this all programmed up is you need to get the camera set the way that you want it to work. And then you're going to go into the shooting menu under shooting mode and camera set memory. And you're going to have all this memorized by the camera saying, okay, you like your camera set up with those settings. When we go to number 1, we're going to turn it into those particular settings. Now, if you want to go in and recall those settings, well, there's going to be a menu setting for going in and recalling those settings. So let's go ahead and get our camera set up for 2 different systems so that we can change back and forth between these 2 different systems. All right, so our first one that we're going to set up for is, let's do it in a pretty simple mode. I'm going to go with a Aperture priority mode, and I'm going to jump into the function menu, and I'm going to make a few changes as well. To start with, I'm going to go with ISO 400. Okay. And let's see, what's my aperture going to be? I'm going to go with f8, the good old f8 and B there philosophy. For the motor drive, I'm going to leave it in the single shot mode. And I'm going to jump into the function menu and I'm going to make a few changes in here. I'm going to change the focus area to center. This isn't my favorite, but I just want to, look at things that have changed. We've got ISO 400, metering system. I'm just going to say I want center weighted metering system for this. I don't normally use that, but let's see, what else do we want to change? Auto white balance. I think that's enough for right now. And so that's our setting that I want programmed from number 1. So I'm going to go into the menu system and I'm going to come down to the shoot mode and the camera set memory. I'm going to go to the right in here and I have the option of storing this in position number 1, 2, 3, or M1 through 4. These are going to be stored on the memory card. I want this stored on the camera. And so it shows us what we have done in here. And so you can actually scroll through and see all the different things that we could change. And you can see that I have only changed a few items on the camera here. And so mainly aperture priority, f8, ISO 400, center weighted metering. And I'm going to press the center button. And that is now registered into number 1. So I'm going to press the shutter release to kick back out of this. Now I'm going to put my camera in a manual mode. And let's do my kind of landscape setup. I'm going to go to ISO 100, best quality there. I'm going to want a little bit more depth of field. Let's go F16 to just choose something different there. Let's jump into the function menu. And what are we going to change there? We're going to go and change this to multi-segment metering. And we're going to put the camera in the self-timer mode because I use that a lot. The 5-second, 2-second self-timer. There we go. All right, so now I'm going to dive back into the menu and I'm going to go to camera set memory, go to the right, and you can see what I have currently set. Where do I want to set that? I'm going to say set in number 2. Press the center button, and now that is registered in number 2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the camera in shutter priority. I'm going to take it out of the self-timer, and I'm going to change the ISO to 200 just because that's a different number. And so let's say I'm shooting in this particular mode and I suddenly want to shoot in my landscape mode. Well, I can just, let's pull up some information here, right here, so we can see exactly what's going on. And so when I switch it over to this number 2 mode, you can see that it is in the manual mode. We've chosen F16. What else do we have? We have the 2-second self-timer set up. But if I change this to number 1, this is more my basic setting. It's in aperture priority, f8. I've got the center weighted metering and ISO 400. And then if I want to get back to where I was shooting a little while ago, I can just throw it back into manual or shutter priority or wherever else I want to go. So that's kind of the idea on how it would be used. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know. I'm pretty sure, I'd bet a lot of money that a lot of people do not use the M1 through 4. It's just a little bit of a pain. I wish they would have put a little bit of memory in the camera so that you didn't have this on a memory card. And you could have it just stored with the camera. But I don't know why they did it. That's why they did it. But I think using memory positions 1, 2, and 3 is a really smart idea for anybody who has some very particular setups and they don't want to have to go through all the steps to get that set up each and every time they do that type of photography. So encourage you to take some time and really go through and set things up and explore all of the options that you can have set in there. It might make shooting out in the field a little bit quicker and a little bit easier and maybe get you some better shots. All right, so that is our mode dial controlling all of our main exposure settings. And now you can see that there is quite a bit more going on in that mode dial than you might guess at first. So a lot of great options, good to be familiar with how it works. Time to move on to the next topic, which is ISO. Seen me play around with this a little bit. Let's talk about it in particular. On the right-hand side of that dial is the ISO options, and this is controlling the sensitivity of the sensor. Now, the native or base sensitivity of this particular camera is 100. This is where you're going to get the least amount of noise and the greatest amount of dynamic range on the sensor. So this is where you should have your camera set for the best images possible. However, sometimes you need to adjust this to accommodate needs with shutter speeds and apertures, and so that's why you can adjust it in here. So We do have an auto setting where the camera will automatically set this according to where it needs with the light. If the camera does have control over shutter speeds like it does in the program mode, it's also going to try to be giving you a shutter speed that is acceptable for handheld work. And this is where the camera is starting to take over a lot of control and makes me feel a little queasy on the inside, but is sometimes good in some situations. It does have a low ISO of 50. Now, the problem with shooting 50 over 100 is it has less dynamic range than ISO 100. So you don't want to use 50 unless you really need a slower shutter speed, in my opinion. Maybe you're shooting a waterfall and you're trying to get down to a particular shutter speed. That might be a reason for using ISO 50. And there's a few other light reasons, but most of the time you'll want to be at 100. Our standard ISO range is going to be going from roughly 100 up to 25,000. And then we have some high settings in there. And these have little lines above and below it like the 50 does to let you know that we're going a little off chart here, you might say. This is where you're going to start lose a bit of quality on your images. Talking about quality, let's go ahead and take a look at the ISO test of what it looks like shooting at different ISOs on this camera. I have my little standard subject that I shoot with all different ISOs, and I will have to say that pretty much everything 50 through 1600 looks very clean on this camera, even when you magnify it up quite a bit. Now, everybody's going to have their own standards as far as what's good and what's good enough, and I think for most people, 50,000 and 100,000 are looking a bit on the rough side, you might say. Even 25,000, I think, is a little bit rough. And I think most people's top acceptable ISO is probably going to be somewhere between 3,200 and 12,800 as far as what looks pretty clean for them. A lot of it depends on personal standards and how the image is actually going to be used. And so you might want to do a little testing yourself to see how your camera does in this particular scenario. Now, if you want to control the ISO with a little bit more detail, you can get in to set the ISO range, the limit of how high and how low it can go, as well as some control over how the ISO works as far as when it's in the auto ISO, what shutter speeds does it kind of force the camera into a higher ISO by diving into the exposure and color menu under exposure. So there'll be more things that we talk about ISO as we get into that particular menu setting later on in this class. Next up, exposure compensation. Now this has an exposure compensation dial on it that looks like it has all the paint rubbed off. This is a kind of a traditional exposure compensation dial that Sony has recently taken all the labels off so that you can reprogram this button to do something else if you don't want it to be your exposure compensation dial. This is kind of a good standard option for this particular dial, but it's not what everybody wants. But I think it's a good one to generally work with. It's got a lock dial or a lock button on it so that you can't turn it accidentally. Now, the idea with exposure compensation is it works when the camera is controlling some part of the exposure, whether it's the shutter speed, the aperture, or the ISO, and you can quickly turn this dial to get a brighter or darker exposure. And this can be really nice when you know your camera's not giving you the right exposure and you have it in a semi-automated or fully automated mode, and you can just adjust it there to get the right exposure. Let's go ahead and take a look at this with our cameras. And so in this particular case, what we're going to do is throw the camera into the program mode. And in the program mode, camera is going to try to give us the best exposure. But I already know with the scene that we've talked about here, we've got the white table, we've got the white cabinet, and that's a little bit lighter than average. And so what we may want to do here is to brighten this up a little bit. And so we make sure this is unlocked and we can lighten this up. We could lighten it up a whole bunch. We don't need to in here. But if we wanted to shoot it a little bit darker, we could just set it there. If we knew that everything in this particular environment was going to be +3, we could lock that button in, and that way we can't turn that dial. If we like to regularly access it, we can simply have it set there. And so this is just a nice quick way when you're in the program or aperture priority, shutter priority mode for quickly changing the exposure. Now, as I say, if you don't like using exposure compensation, maybe you're always using manual exposure and you never end up using that dial, you can reprogram that to do something else. And there's a lot of options, and we'll look at that later in the setup menu when we go to customize the different features of the camera. Now, the way that your camera is reading light is with the metering system. Now, the easiest way to get to the metering system is through the function menu. It's got this option on the top row over on the right-hand side. You can also get to it in the exposure and color menu tab. So there's two different ways. And if you want to program a button to access it because you use it all the time, that's another option that you can do. And we'll look at those options a little bit later on. So the camera has 5 different options on the way it reads light. So let's look at those 5 different options. The first option, the multi option, which is multi-segment metering system here. What it does is it uses a whole bunch of different areas, compares and contrasts, has a whole algorithm that it sends the information through, and gives you a very good reading pretty much in all types of light, especially mixed lighting scenarios. And so it tends to do a very good job in this case. And so this is where most people would leave it most of the time. But I do want to show you a little quirk of the way that this particularly works. So let's go ahead and set the camera up here. Now I'm going to dive into the function menu to make sure that we are in the multi mode, which we are right here. You can see the different options over on the left of the screen there. And we are in the multi mode. Now, for purposes of what we're doing here, I need to change my focusing area, and I'm going to change it to a medium spot small area. Now, we're going to choose aperture priority right now, and we're at f16, which is fine. Notice in the bottom left, we're at 1/5 of a second, okay? If I move my focusing point over here to where it's dark, it's moved it down to 1/4 of a second. And so this multi-metering system is influenced by where the focusing point is, and it will adjust according to that. And it's not changing much here, but it's enough to show you that it does change distinctly on what that focusing point is seeing and how bright the information. And so when it comes to the algorithm, it's heavily weighting where the metering system is. And so be aware that as you move the metering system around, that may change the reading that you get with the multi-metering. All right, next up is a classic center-weighted metering. This measures a big fat spot right in the middle of the frame, and this is the way a lot of the cameras worked in the 70s and 80s. And I don't know if a lot of people use that now, but it's on there for those who do want to use it. The spot metering can be really handy if you want to get a very precise reading in a smaller area. If you have a subject that has a lot of light or dark area around it, you can switch over to a spot and get a very accurate reading for how much light is being reflected off of that particular subject. And there's 2 versions. There's a large one, which is kind of like a smaller center-weighted metering area, and then there's a standard, which is a pretty tight spot. Then there's an entire scene average. And this sometimes works better when there's lots of movement in the frame that can throw off your meter. And so this will probably bounce around a little bit less when it comes to the exposures and those semi-automated exposure modes. And then there is a highlight metering system, which will look at the lightest parts of the frame and try to make sure that you do not overexpose them. And from an exposure standpoint of view, that's a really smart way to work. Now, whether a lot of people use that, I don't know. It can be helpful in some situations. You might want to experiment with that one to see if it works with the way that you like to work with the camera. But I think the safest one for me to recommend for most people is that multi-metering system. I think it works pretty good in most situations. A great way of telling if you have got the right exposure is by checking the histogram. And so this is that little graph in the bottom right hand of the corner that shows you whether you are underexposed, evenly exposed, or overexposed. And so if you're not sure about what the correct reading is, well, you don't want too much information, generally speaking, lots of exceptions, piled up to one side or the other. You generally want a mountain of information in the middle. There's a lot of exceptions and a lot more to this, but that's kind of the general idea of this. And so you can see this live in the viewfinder or on the monitor by pressing the display button to cycle through the different options. It'll come up with some and it'll be off for other options. Now, if you want to turn this feature on and off, well, you're going to need to go into the setup menu if you never want to see it, or if for some reason you don't see it and it's been turned off on your camera. You can go into Operation Customize, the display settings for the screens, and you can have that turned on. Now, you can also see it in the playback mode. You'll hit the display button to cycle through the different display options, and here you get to see it in red, green, and blue. so you can see how each channel is doing and whether it is overexposed or underexposed. That can be a very helpful technique to use. The auto exposure lock button on the camera is something that some people use and some people don't. The way this is designed to work is it locks in the exposure when you're in a semi-automated exposure, which means aperture priority, shutter priority program, things like that. And you want to lock it in and reposition the camera to a new composition. And so that can be very handy. Now, the cool thing is it also works as a manual shift, which I think is fantastic and I wish was on all other cameras, but I think it's only on Sony's. Let me show you how both of those aspects of this particular camera work. All right, so we've got our scene here and we've got our camera in aperture priority. And let's just say that we like the exposure that we're getting over here. It's f16 at a ½ second. If we want to lock that in, we get the asterisk in the bottom right-hand corner. We rotate, and then we can take the photo, and we're going to lock in that exposure there. And you can see normally it's at 1/6 of a second, and so just locking in an exposure and moving it over so that we have it locked in. Now maybe we want to lock in this exposure and move it over here, and we can do that as well. So those are different options. Now in the manual mode, let's get this set here. All right, let's get this set up really nicely for manual. So I'm going to go back down to ISO 100. We'll do the whole F8 and B there. And then whatever shutter speed we think is the correct shutter speed for this scenario. And I'm going to say this is just a little overexposed there, so 0.3. So we're at an 1/8 of a second, F8. We've got the exposure to what I think looks really good. The histogram looks good. But you know what? I want to shoot this at a different exposure now. What I can do is I can press in on the AEL button, and I can turn the dial, and it's turning both the shutter speed and the aperture. You see that? And so now I can shoot this at f16 and say, you know what? Maybe I want to shoot this at f11 as well. Maybe that's going to be sharper, and I can shoot my photo there. And if I want to go back down to f8, I don't have to do adjustments to the shutter speed and aperture. I can just lock that in and adjust one of them, and that just keeps things exactly where I wanted it, just at a different set of standards. So it's very much like the program shift that we talked about before, and this is just manual shift. Now, if you don't use this button, you can have this reprogrammed. You go into Operation Customize, and you select this particular button, and then you can go select whatever feature you want attributed to it. Currently, it's set to AEL Hold, Auto Exposure Lock, and it's holding it in as long as you're holding down on the button. All right, another good way of telling if you're getting the correct exposure is Highlight Alert. Sony calls this zebra displays. What happens when you get overexposed, it'll show you zebras with pixels that are being overexposed. And this is a very visually compelling way to tell you that, no, this picture is way too bright. And one of the things that we are concerned about with current cameras is overexposure. Overexposure is really hard to recover from, and it's hard to fix in post-production. It's one of the reasons why we like shooting with RAW, is it gives us a little bit of latitude to do this with, but it is still somewhat limited even with RAW images. And so if you want to be able to look at the whole scene and tell where the images or where the pixels are that are overexposing, zebra displays will do it. When you dive into the menu system, there's going to be some options, one to turn it on and off, and then a second option as to where the levels are. You can have it come on at the very, very tip of exposure problems, or kind of early on just to see where any problems might be near it. You can even set in some custom ranges where it turns on at a particular level. It could indicate something good. You could have it right where you want your skin tones. So when you have the exposure set correctly, skin tones are going to have those zebra stripes. And so there's a wide variety of ways that you can actually use this. All right, let's talk about exposure bracketing. This is kind of like exposure compensation, but this is where the camera is going to shoot through a series of photographs so that you don't have to do all the adjustments from one photograph to the other. Now, the way you access this is through the drive mode. So by pressing the drive button, you're going to have all the different drive features. A lot of this we'll talk about in another section called Capture Controls. But there's a couple of them that are really designed for dealing with the exposure, and that is bracketing continuous and bracketing single. So when you dive into this particular mode, the idea is the camera is going to shoot through a number of images, and there's a wide variety of images that you can choose from that are of different exposures. Now, the continuous and single option. Single means you press down on the shutter release once for each picture. And if you're trying to time something or you just want to do it fully manually, that's kind of nice, works for that. I like the continuous option. What happens then is when you press down on the shutter release, it fires through all of the shots necessary and then stops. And that way, your whole collection of images is captured in the shortest period of time, which means the lights haven't changed and nothing else is likely to have changed. These types of, this feature is generally best used on subjects that are not moving around a lot. And so this is one of the reasons why I like using aperture priority. You choose a particular depth of field and then your shutter speed, your capture time, adjusts in there. Now the next option is your exposure value. How much difference is there from one image to the next? I think one-stop exposures work pretty well. Some people want to do a little less, some people want to do a little more. There's all those options in there. And then there's the number of shots. How many images do you want to shoot? Usually this is done in odd images so that you can have an image done at correct exposure and then an over and under equal on either side. But in some cases you can also do two images, which is a normal exposure, and then one more that is either underexposed or overexposed. And so when you get into this, you will see what your exposure value is, how much it's going up and down, how many you have set, and then you'll see little arrows in the exposure indicator to show you where those particular pictures are going to be taken. Let's go ahead and do an example of this, and I'll set the camera up for doing a bracket series. Now to start with, I'm going to put my camera in aperture priority. As I say, that's my favorite mode for doing bracket stuff. We're at F8, which I think is pretty good. We're going to go into our drive, and we're going to come down to the bracket options. I'm going to do a single option to start with. I'm going to go to the right, and I want this to be a one-stop bracket. I'm going to go to the right again, and 3 images is going to be perfectly fine for me. I can go to the right here, and that's going to dive me into the menu where there are more advanced options that we're not going to talk about right now. But I'm going to hit the menu to back out of this. And so we're going to do a 3-stop exposure. And you can see with the indicator down along the bottom, we have those little arrows at, let's see, we have a camera set at -3. So we're going to do a little exposure adjustment. I want the F8. Oh, I had the exposure compensation still set there. So now we have our arrows above the 0, the -1, and the +1. And so in the single shot way, what we're going to be doing is one shot. That was our normal exposure. You can see the arrow above the -1. That is going to be our one-stop underexposure. And here's our one-stop overexposure. And that's our bracket series, and we're done. So we would want to go in and turn this off. But I actually want to do it again, but I want to do it in the continuous mode. And in this case, I'm going to do one stop, but I'm going to do 9 images here. Okay, so now you can see all of those arrows from -4 to +4. So all I need to do is I'm going to press down to focus, and then I'm just going to leave my finger down, and it's going to shoot through everything as fast as it can. So that now we're done. I'm going to go in and turn this off because I don't want to accidentally leave this turned on. And let's go back and take a look at what we got. And so let's see if we can get some different information here. So this one here, we've got blinkies telling us it's overexposed, which was the intention. Over on the left-hand side, you can see the +4. That one is the overexposed by 4 stops. And then as we come down, -4 stops, +3, -3, +2, -2, +1, -1, and then our normal exposure. And then our previous bracket series, we had our +1, our -1, and our normal one. Now, I am not the biggest fan of the order that is shot, and that's one of the things that you get to customize when you go into the menu. And as I say, we'll talk more about that later, but that is something that can be customized. If you do want to go in and do it, you can go into your shooting menu under the drive mode, under the bracket settings, and you can change the bracket order. You can also have a self-timer start the whole thing off so that way you're not actually touching the camera. So good option, good place to use in certain situations. All right, we got one more topic that I think falls into the exposure category, and that is if you are having a problem with the exposure that you're getting, there's a couple of common problems. There's a fluorescent flicker that is caused by fluorescent lights, and what's going on is the lights are going up and down in brightness very quickly as you shoot, and as you shoot across a number of images with the camera set completely in manual, you're going to get some varied brightness from one image to the next. And your camera knows how to time things and can fix it if you turn on the right feature. Now, another type of problem is LED flicker. And this comes from LED lights. And this is going to be a problem with, it's going to result in banding. And this is typically going to happen with an electronic shutter. And we'll get into the shutter a little bit later on. But you're going to see these lines going through your image. And this is where the lights are going up and down and turning on and off very quickly, and your camera's sensor, as it's scanning in the information, is getting some blips between the lights going on and off because they're not actually on all the time. They turn on and off so quickly that our human eyes can't see it, but a technical device like a camera can. So in the shooting menu is an anti-flicker feature, and it's controlling two different things. There's fluorescent lights, where you can turn on the anti-flicker shooting on and off. The problem with leaving this turned on all the time is that if you are shooting continuous bursts of images, it can slow down the motor drive a little bit and may cause a conflict with other features that you are using. So this is not something I would recommend just leaving turned on, because in some cases you could leave it turned on, but I generally wouldn't want to. Now, the variable shutter is where you can go in and you can adjust the shutter speed very precisely to avoid the LED flicker. So let me dive into the menu and show you each of these items here. So we're going to dive into the menu, and on this particular one, we're going to go down to the shutter/silent. We'll talk more about the shutter type a little bit later on, especially in the next section of this class. And under anti-flicker set down here, you could just simply turn this on when you have fluorescent lights that are causing a problem and the light levels that you're recording from one image to the next. Normally, you would leave this turned off. Now, before I go to the variable shutter, which you see is grayed out and not available, I'm going to put the camera in a manual mode. You do need to have the camera in a mode that you can manually set shutter speed. So that would be manual exposure or shutter priority. Those two modes, the second part of the feature, the variable shutter, then wakens up and you're allowed to use it. All right, so in this particular case, if I was to set the best exposure I could in here, I'm going to say, I'm going to say an 1/8 of a second. All right, but let's say we were getting some banding because I had LED lights. The lights I have in here right now, to be honest with you, they are LED lights, but these are designed for photography and video, and they don't have a flicker problem. A lot of times you'll have stadiums or rooms or just individual bulbs that are cheaper bulbs. They're more basic LED lights, and they turn on and off more, and that's just the nature of those lights. And if there was a problem, what I would do is I would go into the menu system, I would come into anti-flicker set, and you can see that this is now lit up. It's now available because we're in manual or shutter priority. And if I want to turn this on, I can go ahead and turn it on. And now I have a variable shutter setting. And when I come in here, it's going to allow me to change the shutter speed in very, very fine increments. This is not where you want to make big scale changes. And so little scale changes like this will help you avoid the scanning problem of certain lights. Now, we don't have problem lights in here, so I can't show you what it's going to look like as it gets better and worse, but you'll see it in your photograph. So you would normally, maybe you would have a 1/60th of a second set, and that would be a normal shutter speed. But if you set this at 64.5, you'll completely avoid the scanning problem. Now, one of the options that you can also do is you can do a TV scan where it will scan it by pressing the center button. You can do an anti-flicker TV scan, and it will scan for what it thinks is appropriate. Now, we don't really have a problem in here, so it's not really going through the normal system that you would see where it's correcting for the problem. So I'm going to back out of this. We don't really need this on right now, so I'm going to turn it off. But this is something that if you are working with, if you're an event photographer and you're going to convention halls and stadiums and all sorts of crazy places that have different types of lighting, if you're not getting the exposure you want and there's an exposure problem, there's a good chance that either fluorescent flicker is going to solve the problem or LED flicker. Now, I know what some of you are asking, and so I'll try to answer it. No, you probably don't want to use these both at the same time. Generally, there's going to be a problem with one or the other. Oh man, I hope you don't have to use both of them at the same time. That would be terrible to have a fluorescent flicker light as well as an LED flicker at the same time. I haven't had a chance to see if both of those will fix the problem at the same time, but we're talking extremely rare case scenario. But that's how you would fix the problem. All right, now we're going to be talking more about the topic of exposure when we get into the color and exposure menu. There's going to be some more nuanced settings that we can set in there. And then when we get into the setup menu on the camera, there's going to be a lot of custom controls where maybe you don't like the dial that is currently set for setting apertures and you want to change it to a different dial. Well, you can do that. And so there's a lot of customization that we'll do later on in the setup menu. All right, folks, there you go. Those are your exposure controls. There's lots to work with, so get out there and practice and get to know your camera.